Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today is a very exciting recommendation video because I'm going to be recommending you books based on your cafe orders. So I am now a full-time barista at a local family-owned small coffee shop. I love my job so much, but I definitely am guilty of stereotyping people based on their coffee orders. And I feel like that's acceptable because I also fit into a lot of the stereotypes. So I'm going to be recommending books based on stereotypes of coffee orders or people that order certain drinks. Side note, this is not going to be a Starbucks order kind of video. I do not work at Starbucks, nor do I ever go get Starbucks. I'm not judging you if you do, but I personally hate Starbucks. So any of those crazy drinks that Starbucks has, I will not be discussing. I'm just going to be talking about the basic cafe orders that you can find most anywhere at any independent coffee shop. And I'm also not judging anybody for their coffee orders or what they may be like if they order certain drinks. This is just for fun and silliness, and I'm a barista, so I'm qualified to talk about this. So I thought it would be fun to merge two of my favorite things, books and coffee/cafes, and recommend some books based on your cafe order. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So all of the orders that I talk about in this video are going to be orders that I've gotten while I'm at work as a barista, but I'll definitely do a part 2 if you guys leave your coffee orders in the comments, and I will totally go through and recommend you books personally. So if you're interested in that, definitely leave a comment below with your cafe order. First up, we're going to start with a very basic order that a lot of people get, but it's also just the most baseline coffee drink that I can think of, and that is black drip coffee. So to me, somebody who orders a black drip coffee is just looking for function. They're just looking for a boost of caffeine in the morning or to get through a long night or whatever it may be. They're just looking for the most caffeine, the easiest, and they don't care about taste as much. It's not that they don't care how the coffee tastes, it's just more about the function of the coffee than the taste of the coffee. So this is a person who drinks coffee without the frills, and my first instinct when picking a book that has no frills in a way would be a nonfiction book, and not some kind of experimental nonfiction book or a memoir, anything like that, something that is just factual information. So my first recommendation for nonfiction would be anything by Michael Pollan. So Michael Pollan writes a lot of books about food and growing food and how we cook food and all these different things related to food and diet and nutrition and all of that. But he does it in a way that's not boring. He brings a lot of different elements into the nonfiction. It doesn't feel dry, but it still is very factual and fact-based. It doesn't really bring in a ton of personal experience or anything like that. It is mostly rooted in the facts. So I really did like The Botany of Desire as well as Cooked. Cooked focuses on the ways that we prepare food and how that affects us. And The Botany of Desire is about growing different plants and how each of the plants that's discussed plays into one of our core desires. So they're both really interesting, and like I said, there's not a ton of frills to these. It is very much just a nonfiction book. So the next book I'm going to recommend has a few more frills, if you will, but it's still a very informative nonfiction book, and that is From Here to Eternity by Caitlin Doughty. So this is a book about Caitlin Doughty, who's a mortician, and she travels the world trying to discover and write about different practices surrounding death in different areas. So she's very involved with everything that's going on, but her voice isn't overly present. It still does focus on the different practices with death. And the reason why I say that it's more frilly is because there are photos throughout, or there's illustrations throughout, and it definitely feels like a more fast-paced, easy to get through book. It's not super dense, it's not super crazy on the facts, but it definitely feels fact-based and feels like nonfiction, but it's a little bit more digestible. So those are my nonfiction recommendations for black coffee, and the final recommendation for black coffee would be something that's entirely based on my boyfriend. His coffee order is almost always a black drip coffee. It's kind of funny because he'll either get a black coffee or he'll get the most frilly, fruity drink that you can imagine, which is pretty hilarious. But I would say 98% of the time, he just gets black coffee. And based on him, I would like to recommend The Martian by Andy Weir. So The Martian is about an astronaut who is left on Mars because the rest of his crew is escaping when there is a storm, and they think that he's dead, but really he survived, and he basically has to figure out how to survive on Mars until someone can come get him. And because travel through space takes so long, he has to survive for quite a long time. So it's sort of a log of every day on Mars and what he does and how he deals with problems he encounters and all of that. So it definitely feels like a very Sean book. I'm not really sure how to describe why I think someone who drinks black coffee would like this book, but maybe it's just my association with my boyfriend, or maybe it's just the fact that the book itself feels functional and feels very scientific, even though it's science fiction. But I think it would work really well for someone who drinks black coffee. So those are my recommendations for the first coffee order. All right, moving right along, we have an order that I don't get very often, but when I do, it's usually a child, and that is chocolate milk. So we almost always have chocolate milk on deck because we use the chocolate milk to make cafe mochas, but sometimes people will just order chocolate milk, and it's usually for a little kid. But if you are someone who orders chocolate milk and you are not a child, may I recommend some children's books, because maybe you're a child at heart. My first recommendation would be the Tea Dragon Society series by Kay O'Neill. These books are about a community which is raising these tea dragons, which are really tiny dragons that produce tea leaves on their horns. So it's about the dragons, but it's about the cares for the dragons as well, and the community that's sort of forged around the dragons. So a lot of it is about finding friendship, coming of age, family dynamics, friend dynamics, and it is a graphic novel series as well, so the art is just so beautiful, and the story is just very sweet and easily digestible and very, very fun, even if you're not in the target age range. I believe this is a middle grade series, but just a lot of fun regardless of your age. And then next we have a childhood favorite of mine, which is The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster. So this one follows a young boy, Milo, who is very bored, and all of a sudden he has a package, a giant package, delivered to his living room, and he's like, what is this? And inside the box is sort of a portal of sorts to a very different world. And it's really hard to describe what this world is, but it's just all based on like puns related to math and English, and it's really hard to explain. But for example, Milo visits the Island of Conclusions, which you have to jump to get to. And then the two sisters that are supposed to be queens of the world are Rhyme and Reason. There is a math kingdom and a word kingdom, and each one has different structures and ways of going about things. So it is just a very fun book, but it's also a lot more complex than you would expect for a middle grade book. There's just a lot of things that you can really appreciate as an adult that you didn't necessarily get or appreciate as much if you read it as a child. So even if you have read this, I would totally recommend rereading it. It's such a fun read, especially as an adult, and I think you would really enjoy it. So those are my book recommendations if you order chocolate milk at a cafe. All right, let's talk about the people who come in and order a black Americana with extra shots. So let me just explain an Americana if you don't know. Sometimes it's called an Americano, sometimes it's called an Americana, but different cafes have different ways of saying it. But in essence, it is espresso and hot water, or if it's iced, espresso and cold water over ice. And a lot of people order an Americana black at my coffee shop. Basically, an Americana is an approximation of drip coffee using espresso. So it's espresso that's really watered down. I personally don't think it's very good, but I know a lot of people who really like it, so who am I to judge? So at the coffee shop that I work at, a large Americana gets 3 shots of espresso already, but a lot of people will order like extra shots and then just fill the rest of the cup up with hot water, which is a lot of espresso, and it's very concentrated and highly caffeinated. So my thought on someone who orders an Americana is that they are a thrill seeker. They're looking for the most caffeine they can possibly get. They're looking for high energy. They're just a little bit unhinged potentially, because I can't imagine that tastes very good or that your body's reaction to that is very great. Maybe for a little while it's great, but the crash is going to be intense. So somebody who orders an Americana black with extra shots is just slightly unhinged. And I just want to recommend some books that feel unhinged, that kind of match the energy of that person. Though I will say that some of the books I'm recommending here are some of my favorite books, so maybe I just have problems also, even though I don't drink Americanas. That's not the point of this video. Since this is a genre that I read a lot of, I have 4 recommendations, so I'll just go through them quickly. The first one is Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. I know everybody probably knows this book, but it's basically about a woman who is from a small town and has to go back to the small town to investigate a murder, and it's about all the crazy stuff that happens when she gets there. So it is very intense, it is very scary and unhinged in a lot of ways, and I just love it. Next, we have I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid, which is one of my favorite books of all time. So you've probably heard about this one, but this is about a man named Jake and his girlfriend as they drive through the snow to get to his parents' house to visit. And it's about all the conversations that they have while they're driving, what happens when they get to visit the parents, and everything that happens after that, and how everything just unravels. And there's a huge twist at the end, but this book will absolutely stick with you, and it will definitely feed into the just unhinged energy that you have. Next, we have Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. This one is about a woman named Irina who is a photographer, and she takes photos of boys, men in compromising positions, compromising outfits, etc. So Irina is a very unhinged, unlikable narrator, and we just see her fall into her addiction and her mental illness, and we kind of get an idea of the traumas in her past and what has led to this point, and it's just really creepy. This is definitely a vibe. I think you would really, really enjoy it. And then finally, we have Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. This is a short story collection of horror stories. So this one is translated and it is set in Argentina. But this book basically just takes elements of Argentine folklore and myth and supernatural things, and it melds it with the more real life horrors of relationships and society and the politics of Argentina and all of that. It does it brilliantly. The story collection is horrifying and wonderful, and you will enjoy every moment of it if you're into horror. So highly, highly recommend Things We Lost in the Fire. And those are my recommendations if you're a crazy person and you drink an Americana black with extra shots. Okay, moving right along to a very classic drink, and that is the latte or cafe latte. So a latte is comprised of espresso and steamed milk, but the milk is not super frothy, so it's a very delicate foam, and that leaves a lot of room for latte art, which is when you use your steamed milk to create art on the top layer of the espresso, which is called the crema. So to me, a latte is very classic. It's simple but elegant. It is very aesthetic because, like I said, you have that opportunity for art, which means that a lot of people order lattes to take photos of them. So it just feels to me like a very classic drink, and someone who orders a latte is kind of elevated in a simplistic way, especially if they just order a latte without sugar, without syrups, without any additives or anything like that. It's just espresso and milk. It just feels very classic and elegant and simple. So I have 2 different types of recommendations for someone who orders a latte, but the first one would be poetry. So in my mind, poetry is very simple but elegant. It's understated, but it packs a really huge punch. My first recommendation is The Red Wheelbarrow and Other Stories by William Carlos Williams. This is a very cute and tiny edition. I'm sure you know who William Carlos Williams was, but he was a doctor and he started writing poetry as he went to visit different patients at their homes. And the reason that I got into this is because his poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, is featured in The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, which is my favorite book. So I have the poem memorized. So Williams is a pretty classic poet. A lot of people have heard of him, but he isn't necessarily up there with like the poets that everybody has read. So if you haven't read Williams, definitely pick it up. It's very classic and simple. A lot of his poems are very short and concise, but they really do pack a punch and they stay with you. So if you're interested in poetry, pick this one up. The next poetry collection I have is Felicity by Mary Oliver. So this is a wonderful collection which focuses on nature as well as relationships. So Mary Oliver was an incredible poet, and honestly, I would recommend picking up any of her collections, whichever one sounds the most interesting to you. This is just the one that I happen to have, and it's my favorite one that I've read so far. So yeah, if you like nature poetry and very like introspective kind of poetry, Mary Oliver is amazing. And then the other sort of section for lattes would be classics. So like I said, lattes feel very classic, and what better to read than actual classics? But the first one is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I obviously don't have to explain to you, but it is a very interesting book to read if you haven't read it, because you kind of get an idea of where all of this media has come from, and it's so incredibly different from all of the media that's come since. So if you're interested, check it out. It's really not that scary, but it'll make you look really smart. And then a little bit of a less well-known classic would be anything by Flannery O'Connor, especially her short stories. So I haven't read this entire book, but I do love Flannery O'Connor's stories, and they are technically classics, especially the story A Good Man is Hard to Find. That one is taught all across college classes for English. So if you're into classics and you want to read something that you might not have read yet, Flannery O'Connor. And those are my recommendations if you order a latte. All right, moving right along, we have a very, very tiny drink that at my coffee shop doesn't get ordered a ton, but I know it is a very, very popular drink worldwide, and that is a shot of espresso, straight up, nothing in it, just a shot of espresso. So a shot of espresso to me, without anything added to it, is very punchy, it's very strong, and it's very, very small. So when I think of all of those things, I think about somebody who's looking for the most impact in a very short amount of time or energy. So they're looking to get the most flavor and punch in the most compact way. So of course, what better way to get the most impact in a short time than reading short stories? So I have 2 individual short stories to recommend, as well as 2 short story collections. So the first story I want to recommend is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I have this book, which includes her novel as well as The Yellow Wallpaper, but The Yellow Wallpaper is a story about a woman who is suffering from what seems to be postpartum depression, and she's put under a rest cure, which was something that a lot of women who had depression were put under, and her husband is her doctor as well as her husband, so she has 2 sort of sources of authority telling her that she has to stay in this room with yellow wallpaper. She can't write, she can't read, she can't do anything but just sit in this room and rest. She can't see her baby, she can't go outside, nothing. And she finds a way to start writing, and it just details her experience in the rest cure and how she descends into madness. It is a fascinating story. It is very feminist and intense, and it's about 20 pages long, but it packs so much punch in those pages. It's just an incredible story, and if you're looking for something that's really punchy and short, definitely check out The Yellow Wallpaper. So another short story that packs a big punch is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. So this is a collection of her stories, but I'm just specifically talking about The Lottery. A lot of people have read The Lottery. It is basically a story about a community who stones a person every year, I believe, and they choose the person who's going to get stoned from a lottery. So they draw names out of a hat, and they basically just stone the person who is chosen. There isn't really a lot of backstory as to why that happens. We're basically just thrown into this community and expected to understand it. And maybe we're not expected to understand it. Maybe we're just expected to go along with it and try to figure out what's going on. There really isn't a lot of explanation, and that's something that I love about short story collections in a way, because you have to come up with your own explanation. You have to think about why what's happening is happening, what led up to that point, because you're just given a really, really small chunk of time to be with the characters and understand the plot. So as you can tell, I'm very passionate about short stories, and this is a really, really great place to start if you're looking for something that is terrifying and very, very fascinating in a very tiny, tiny little package. And then I have 2 very punchy and amazing short story collections that I have read recently. The first one I just read this month, and it is Apple and Knife by Intan Paramediva. This is translated from the Indonesian, and it is basically retellings or reimaginings of different fairy tales and folk tales. So the stories feel very mythic, they have a lot of supernatural elements involved, and they are very, very feminist. So the collection focuses on women and the struggles with inhabiting a female body in today's world. It's a very intense collection, and it explores a lot of different aspects of womanhood. and it's just an amazing, dark, funny, weird read. Most of these stories are very, very short. They're just a few pages, so they're very easily digestible. You can sit down and just read one if you have a short amount of time, or you can sit down and read the whole book because it's very short. So amazing short story collection, definitely give it a read. And then finally, we have The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Filya. So this is a collection that I read in December of last year, and this is about women trying to reconcile their identities with religion. So their identity in the context of faith, their identity as a woman, their sexuality, dealings with purity culture and things like that, and dealing with Blackness and how that interplays with religion and womanhood, etc. So it's a book that's about intersectionality and dealing with religion. It's a fascinating collection. It's very enlightening and very punchy and intense. The stories are all tied together really beautifully, but every story does feel like its own individual package and something that you can just read on its own and then move on to the next one later. It's just an amazing collection. Please read it if you haven't read it, and I think you would love all of those books / short stories if you like a shot of espresso. All right, moving right along. We have a drink at the coffee shop, which is sort of like a frappuccino, but it's just basically a frozen espresso coffee drink with chocolate and whipped cream and all of that. So the kind of person that usually orders this is somebody who's just looking for something very sweet, something that feels more like a dessert drink. It's not so much about being caffeinated or getting any kind of coffee concentration at all. It's just about something that's going to taste delicious. So the kind of vibe of books that I would associate with that drink are very lighthearted and happy books. So the best thing I can recommend for that are romances. And I haven't read a ton of romances, but I'm gonna recommend two that I really like. The first one is Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. This is a YA graphic novel romance series, and it's about these two boys who fall in love. It's very cute and sweet, and it feels realistic. So there are moments where there are negative things pulled in. It's not all just happy-go-lucky all of the time. So it feels realistic, but it's also just very cute and fun and something to escape into. So if you like a frozen coffee drink, I think you would like Heartstopper. Next, we have Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This was the first adult romance novel I ever read, and I think the only one I've ever read, honestly, at this point. But this basically follows a woman named Chloe who has fibromyalgia, and her life has really slowed down. She really doesn't have a lot to be excited about. She doesn't go out. She doesn't do a lot because of her chronic pain. And she meets a guy named Redford, which is quite a name, but Red. And he basically is her ticket to do fun things, to learn more, to just get out more. So it's about their love story, and it's very cute. And Red is a very emotionally mature and vulnerable character, which you don't see a lot for the male characters in romances. So that was very sweet and wonderful, and I really, really enjoyed their relationship. So I think both of those books would be really fun if you are somebody who likes frozen coffee. All right, this is the last recommendation for today's video, and this one is cold brew. So I drink iced coffee and cold brew a lot, but I wanted to just talk specifically about cold brew. And if you drink this with oat milk, you are definitely even more in this category, but we're just gonna talk about cold brew. So this totally applies to me, but I'm just gonna call everybody out. If you drink cold brew, you're probably a little bit hipster, and you probably wanna read something that you can annotate, something really thoughtful or introspective. You're looking for something that makes you seem smart or makes you feel smart. And you're also probably looking for something artistic, something that is experimental or unique. So for that, I have a few book recommendations. The first is Birds Art Life by Kyle McClear. This is a book about a woman who is dealing with her father's illness, and she's grieving. And in that time, she finds bird watching, and she finds a way to use that to spark her creativity and get back to being creative despite her grief. So it is a very introspective book. There are a lot of artworks throughout. There are also photos in the book. So it definitely is a memoir of sorts, but it's more about the artistic process and ways to find inspiration. And if you are a cold brew drinker, I think you would definitely enjoy this book. Next, we have Bluets by Maggie Nelson. This is a book I've talked about a lot on my channel, but it is basically Maggie Nelson's thoughts on the color blue and all of the things she associates with the color. So anything from emotions to people to historical events, etc. She just uses like 200 something vignettes to just talk about the color blue in all its different forms and contexts. So this is something that I read for a class, and I felt very smart reading it. I felt like I had so much to say about it because there's just so many things to relate to life and so much to talk about. So if you identify with kind of the hipster vibe, I think you would really like this book. It is definitely something that I'm going to go back to again and again, and it's very unique. So the last book I'm going to recommend to you for this video is The Exhibition of Persephone Q by Jessie Jezeweska Stevens. So this is about Percy, and she is pregnant and hasn't told anyone, not even her husband. And one day she gets a book in the mail, which is a collection of photos from an exhibition of photos that she thinks are of her, and she doesn't have any memory of being in these photos. She doesn't know where this came from. The artist is an ex of hers, and it's basically about her trying to figure out why that happened, if the person is really her, and sort of dealing with a lot of emotions that come up in this process. So it's about Percy, but it's also about how our image is so not safe in the digital era and how our image can be used in different ways, and we have no control over that. So it is something that brings up a lot of relevant concerns and relevant ideas. It's very short, so it's a very quick read, but there's a lot to talk about and think about and be introspective about with this book. So those are my recommendations for someone who drinks cold brew. So those are all of the recommendations based on your cafe order for this video. I would love to make a part 2. So like I said, leave your coffee orders and your cafe orders in the comments below, and I will definitely make a part 2 for this. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I had so much fun coming up with these recommendations. If you liked this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.